Thanks for joining us here on Capitol Tonight. I'm Augustine Garfias. Tonight, a fight over school vouchers is brewing at the Capitol. The House has officially released its bill, and it has some notable differences from the Senate's bill. The House's plan would put $1 billion toward education savings accounts, and it ties the program's per-student benefits to public education funding. Under the bill, participating students will get an amount equal to 85% of what public schools get for each student. That's the key departure from the Senate plan, which gives participating students a set amount of $10,000. To talk more about school funding and the policy behind it, we want to bring in our reporter roundtable. Joining us this Friday is state politics reporter Bayless Wagner and K-12 education reporter Carrie Heath from the Austin American-Statesman. To the both of you, thanks for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Carrie and Bayless, we know you've both done a deep dive on Texas's education spending. What funding issues could a voucher proposal cause public schools? Bayless, we'll start with you and then we'll move to Carrie.
Yeah, so possibly the main one, the most direct one, is that if any students leave public schools, funding is calculated per attending student, so the funding will leave with them. But also you could argue, well, you wouldn't need as much funding if they're no longer attending that public school. But there's also a question of, could there be at some point in the future an issue where the general revenue becomes squeezed because vouchers are taking up, some of the revenue?
Carrie.
Yeah, the lawmakers who've drafted these bills, Senator Brandon Creighton in the Senate and Representative Brad Buckley in the House, contend that these bills are funded completely separately from public schools and that they would not impact the funding for public schools. But those who oppose school vouchers, the public school advocates and superintendents who are opposed to these measures are worried about exactly the scenario that Bayless just laid out, that any funding that is going to this program would take away dollars that these schools that are in deficit budgets really desperately need. And they're also worried about the set costs that public schools need to function. For example, there are counselors, principals, librarians that a school needs no matter how many students go to that school. And so they're worried about students exiting schools and still needing to fund those kinds of costs.
This week, the House filed its version of a school voucher bill. Carrie, you've looked further into both the House and Senate bill on vouchers. What are the key differences?
Right, so as you mentioned, there are some funding differences in the way that they would calculate, the two bills would calculate the amount given to students. The Senate bill would allocate $10,000. The House bill bases the funding off of public school funding, and it would also be about $10,000, but really the key difference is in special education students. The Senate bill would give $11,500 for special education students going to a private school, but the House bill is much more generous, and they would give special education students really the amount that they would get if they were going to public school, up to about $30,000.
Earlier this week, Governor Greg Abbott said that Texas public schools receive $15,000 per student, but educators often point to the state allocating $6,000 per student. Bayless, can you break down the difference between these two numbers and what other funding sources the governor is including in his statement?
Absolutely. So the $6,000 is the basis of school funding that the state allocates. So that's called the basic allotment. Each student, and it's based on not just enrolled students, but actually, the attending students. So the number of students that attend a school ends up being lower than the number of students who are enrolled. But on top of the basic allotment, the state allocates additional money for students with special education needs, for things like teacher pay incentives. And so it ends up being a little bit higher. You also have federal funding on top of that. And so Governor Abbott's number includes federal, local, and state funding, and it also includes something called facilities funding, which is debt that local taxpayers vote to take out, and which isn't part of classroom maintenance costs. And so that's why when we did this analysis, all the experts that we talked to, with varied perspectives on school finance said, you really shouldn't include facilities funding. in your overall total per student because it doesn't go to classrooms, it doesn't go directly to students, it goes to sports fields, it goes to renovations. And so we found that the total amount is more like $14,000 when you include federal funding, and then it'll soon be lower if the state doesn't increase its allocation because federal funding from the COVID-19 pandemic is running out.
Thank you for that breakdown. The House also proposed a bill to fund public schools, increasing the per pupil allotment by a little over $200. In the past, the governor has said any education spending bill will have to be tied to a voucher bill in order to get signed. So, Carrie, do you see a path between the House and Senate voucher bills to meet in the middle, or could their differences end up being a dead end?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key question. Democrats who are on the Public Education Committee yesterday said that they were still very much opposed to a school voucher bill. And, you know, at this point, those who are supporting school vouchers, the Speaker of the House, Justin Burrows, the governor, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, all say the votes are there in the House to pass this. But, you know, the Democrats who are opposed to this are saying that, you know, they don't think that the votes are there. So I think time will tell. But, you know, so a lot of school districts across Texas really are running on a deficit budget. So I think that many of them are hoping that some sort of funding measure will pass.
Yeah. Well, that is all the time we have for now. Carrie Bayless, thanks so much for coming in for our Reporter Roundtable.
Thanks so much, Augustin.
Along with vouchers, the Senate Education Committee is approving a bill to give teachers pay raises based on performance and experience. But some educators say the bill doesn't do enough. Our Aaron Davis has more.
There are 2 educators in this Lockhart ISD elementary school classroom, but only one will get a pay raise under the Senate's teacher pay raise bill.
In Lockhart ISD, almost half of our staff are not in the classroom. You know, you have people who support classroom instruction, who support learning, who also are in need of a raise as well.
Conroe Senator Brandon Creighton's bill, which was unanimously approved by a Senate committee Thursday, establishes pay raises for 3rd and 5th year teachers.
Ensuring that they don't just start strong, but that they stay strong in their careers going forward.
Creighton says the bill's funding model will also remove guardrails from the district's discretionary spending, which he hopes result in more money to pay other educators.
That basic allotment can also be used in ways it hasn't been used before for energy costs and transportation costs and day-to-day things that affect some districts different than other districts.
But all this could be held hostage. In previous sessions, Governor Greg Abbott promised he wouldn't sign a bill for more public school funding without the passage of a school voucher bill that would send tax dollars to private schools. Still, one educator says they don't plan to stop pushing back against vouchers.
No amount of incentives that they throw at us is going to throw us from that path. And that's the issue that the governor is having, is that he can't buy the educators off at this moment. We are going to continue to say that vouchers are wrong for Texas.
Lockhart superintendent will continue to advocate for a proposal to increase pay for educators in and out of the classroom.
The cost of living has outpaced their pay. And it is not right that public school educators and teachers across the state of Texas cannot afford to live in the communities.
For Capital Tonight, I'm Aaron Davis.
A federal judge in Washington is allowing President Trump's mass firing of federal workers to move forward. The judge found that the unions representing workers don't have standing to block the layoffs. The unions must instead follow a different process outlined in federal employment law to fight the firings. The ruling comes as thousands of federal government employees have been fired in just the first few weeks of the Trump administration. In Texas alone, tens of thousands of federal employees are on edge, worried about their future. Our Rena Diamante introduces us to one such employee whose job is temporarily on pause.
I'm not going to sit there and say that I don't check my account every day to make sure that I still have access.
Brittany Coleman frequently checks to make sure she can log into the U.S. Department of Education's network. She's been an attorney for the DOE's Office of Civil Rights in Dallas for almost 6 years, mainly helping Texas students with disabilities. After the Trump administration began, her work has been put on pause, and she's bracing for the possibility it may end permanently.
It may mean that it could affect how they're able to handle their coursework or their conduct, and that can have long-lasting effects. So it's very concerning to know that the work is stopped and that we may not be able to intervene in a timely manner.
Coleman is among the almost 130,000 federal workers in Texas. She's also the chief steward for American Federation of Government Employees Local 252. Its national chapter has held demonstrations in Washington, where Texas Democrats have been vocal criticizing the budget-cutting efforts by President Donald Trump and his billionaire ally Elon Musk.
I myself am a cancer patient, and I think about how many people have placed their hope in a cure for things like cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer's, and the fact that as that research funding is cut and employees who do that kind of work have their grants and other funding frozen, it makes it less likely that we're going to get to those cures. And so that's making it more dangerous and more expensive for the American people.
Coleman says she believes there's been a misunderstanding about their jobs. She hopes her colleagues put on leave will be able to get back to work.
We want to work for the American public. Our colleagues want to be back on duty so they can work for the American public.
The Education Department enforces civil rights protections for students, oversees financial aid, and provides funding to local schools. President Trump has called for shutting down the department, but many experts say only Congress can do that. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capitol Tonight.
With an intense conservative agenda on the table this legislative session, the state's big three Republican leaders seem to be getting along. Earlier this week, the governor praised new House Speaker Dustin Burrows for vowing to pass vouchers through the House. And last week, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick called Burrows the smartest man in the House. To break down more of the dynamics between the big three, we spoke to two political analysts earlier this week to get their thoughts. Take a listen.
I think it's better, and I think it's better on policy. And the policy that's better is the fact that I think all three of these leaders want to pass educational savings accounts. I think they want to provide some choice in the public education system for parents. I think they're going to focus on special needs kids. I think that issue divided the governor, the speaker, and the lieutenant governor last time. I think we saw that play itself out in an acrimonious primary season. And I don't think that will be the case now. And in some ways, the fact that the Texas budget and the Texas economy is doing so well means there's a budget surplus, which I think means even less pressure on the lawmakers to make incredibly difficult choices. So I think it's early in session. It's too early to declare victory, certainly too early to say that there won't be conflict, but I think things are markedly different because of that dominant issue.
Manny, from a Democratic viewpoint, is the dynamic any different this session?
Look, Dustin Burrows got to the job talking about how the institution was going to stand against the billionaires. And yet, now in the first policy conversation, as Ted was explaining, he's giving in to the private school voucher proposal, which is what the billionaires are imposing onto the Texas House. But really, when you're looking at how he got there, 49 of the 62 Democrats voted for Dustin Burrows. That was the big block that was necessary for him to get able to get the opportunity to grab the speaker gavel, because the Republicans couldn't decide amongst themselves who was going to be their leader. That tension is going to exist the entirety of the legislative session. Like Ted said, we are very early in the legislative session. The tension between the governor's office, the Senate, and the chamber is a structural tension. We're going to be seeing this tension come up as we go through the course of the legislative session.
Ted, what are the key areas of alignment and also potential conflict among the three leaders for the current legislative session?
I think there's alignment on public school reform. I suspect that there will be a bipartisan coalition on property tax relief among the two chambers. I suspect that there will be some alignment on potential teacher pay raises. And then I think there could be some alignment on how we deal with border security. Look, Manny's right. the speaker owes a large debt to the vast majority of Democrats that voted for him to become speaker. I'm not sure how that manifests itself, but it will manifest itself. And it will manifest itself in a way that the Democrats will sort of say, here are the things we just can't have. Of course, they would love to stop educational savings accounts, or some people call them vouchers. I don't think that they will be able to do that. But again, I think things are better when there's a budget surplus and there is a big budget surplus.
Manny, given the Lieutenant Governor's past conflict with House leadership, what strategies might boroughs employ to maintain a productive working relationship with Dan Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, you started to see it right now. He appeared with the governor in showing that there's some openness to this conversation about private school vouchers. We're not going to see how quickly that conversation is going to go forward. I expect a long conversation throughout the course of the legislative session. But like Ted said, there is a very important block of Democrats that gave the speakership to Dustin Burrows. There is no Democratic chairs involved in the governing process anymore. So moving forward is going to be very important to the Texans that elected these Democrats that represent this percentage of Texas to make sure that they are involved substantively in the governing process. And should they not be represented in the governing process, there is going to be questions about how their voices are respected in the governing process. And if Dan Patrick, the Lieutenant Governor, pushes an ultra-conservative MAGA agenda through the Senate and over to the House and expects the House to reflect that the same way, that is simply not the way the House is operating or expected to operate.
Ted, how do you assess the likelihood of the three leaders avoiding multiple special sessions this time, considering their stated willingness to cooperate?
Victor, there are three things. You should never predict the Dallas Cowboys football season, never predict the weather in Texas, and you should never predict whether the Texas legislature will get their work done on time. But I will tell you that the kerfuffles that we have had that have extended into special sessions on property tax relief, I don't expect to happen this session. I do think that there is a deal to be had on educational savings accounts. These big structural issues, I don't expect to be there. But what's always great and a little maddening about session is there's always those shiny objects that no one really sees coming that take over the session and end up being a dominant theme. I don't know what those are, but they're out there, and the chances of us being here this summer, well, they're not zero.
Tonight, we're getting a look at the first migrant encounter numbers of 2025, and they show a sharp decline. In January, agents encountered just over 60,000 migrants. That's almost 40,000 fewer encounters than in December. Texas Representative Tony Gonzalez is hoping to make border security a priority in his new role as chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Conference. Our Rena Diamante has more.
Congressman Tony Gonzalez says Hispanic voters in Texas and across the country helped to secure victories for Republicans in the last election.
You're seeing gains all across the country with the Hispanic community voting Republican, in many cases for the first time.
Gonzalez was recently named chair of the Congressional Hispanic Conference, a group of Hispanic Republicans that was formed in 2003 to address national and international issues affecting the Hispanic community. The San Antonio Republican and Navy veteran is the conference's first chair who hails from the Lone Star State.
Our members are in battleground districts. They're in tough seats. They've won very tough races. And a big part of winning is you have to show up early, you have to show up often, and you have to deliver. You cannot just deliver rhetoric.
During the last election, President Donald Trump built on the gains he made with Hispanic voters in South Texas since 2016. He flipped a number of Hispanic majority counties along the southern border, including Starr County, which a Republican presidential candidate last won in 1896.
We don't know if these changes in political preferences are changes that are going to stay over time. And the important thing here is that both political parties parties, Democrats and Republicans, have not invested heavily on the Latino community.
Political science professor Geronimo Cortina believes it's still too soon to say whether it's a lasting voting trend or the appeal of Trump and his message.
Now, the big question is if the Trump administration is going to deliver, and if it's going to deliver fast.
Gonzalez is not afraid to split from his party. He says the conference will not only support Trump's hardline border security measures, but also push for expanding legal pathways to immigration.
We have to secure the border. We have to make sure that our communities are safe. We also have to protect legal immigration, though. We also have to protect work visas, those that are coming over doing it the right way.
Gonzalez says, as chair of the Congressional Hispanic Conference, other priorities include tax reforms as well as regulatory reforms when it comes to the oil and natural gas industry. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capital Tonight.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage. And click the subscribe button here. You can also download our app and watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.